October 15, 1981. Muhammad Ali had been retired for 8 months. The Parkinson's was already starting to show. That's exactly why Marcus Kane chose that corner outside Torino's boxing gym to call out the greatest fighter who ever lived. 300 pounds of muscle, 26 years old. Marcus stepped right up to Ali and said the words that would change everything. "You're nothing but a weak old man now." What happened in the next 90 seconds became the most talked about street encounter in Philadelphia boxing history. The newspapers ran it front page. And for 40 years, when people talked about respect, they always came back to this moment. The moment a bodybuilder learned the difference between size and strength. The moment Muhammad Ali reminded the world why legends never truly retire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The autumn wind carried the smell of sweat and leather through the cracked windows of Torino's boxing gym as Vince Torino pushed himself through another set of heavy bag combinations. At 58, his hands still moved with the precision that had once guided champions, but the fire in his shoulders burned longer now, and the recovery took twice as long. He'd been working the bag for 20 minutes when the shouting started outside. Vince paused mid-combination, his wrapped knuckles still pressed against the worn leather. Through the grimy storefront window, he could see a crowd gathering on the corner of Broad and Morris. In South Philadelphia, crowds meant trouble, and trouble meant bad for business. What little business he had left. The gym was nearly empty at 3 in the afternoon. Just Tommy Ricci shadowboxing in the corner, and Mrs. Castellano's grandson working the speed bag with all the rhythm of a broken washing machine. The kid had heart but no talent, which somehow made it worse. Vince had learned to spot difference 20 years ago, usually too late to matter. He unwrapped his hands and moved toward the window, squinting through the October glare. The crowd was growing, maybe 15 people now, forming a loose circle around 2 figures. One was massive, built like a refrigerator with legs. The other was smaller, older, moving with a familiar shuffle that made Vince's chest tighten. "Ah, Christ," he whispered, recognizing the gentle giant who'd been coming around the neighborhood more often lately. Muhammad Ali had been stopping by South Philly regularly since his retirement, sometimes just to walk, sometimes to visit the old gyms where working-class dreams still sweated through canvas and rope. Vince grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. Whatever was happening out there, it wasn't going to end well. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he'd felt it that night in 1978 when everything went wrong and he'd been too proud, too stubborn, too afraid to do what needed to be done. The cold air hit him as he stepped onto Broad Street. The crowd had grown to nearly 30 people now, cell phones out, though in 1981 it was just notebooks and witnesses. The massive bodybuilder stood chest to chest with Ali, who looked smaller than Vince remembered, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "You hear me, old man?" The bodybuilder's voice carried across the street like a sledgehammer. "All that dancing around the ring, all that pretty footwork, where's it gotten you? Look at you now, shaking like a leaf." The crowd murmured, some uncomfortable, others eager for drama. Vince felt his own hands curl into fists as he pushed through the circle of onlookers. This wasn't just disrespect, this was cruelty. Ali's condition wasn't a secret, but it wasn't entertainment either. "You think you're some kind of legend?" Marcus Kane continued, though Vince didn't know the name yet. "My old man could have taken you on your best day. Least he knew when to quit before he embarrassed himself." Ali's response came soft, barely audible over the street noise, but everyone leaned in to hear it. "I fought for something bigger than myself, son. What you fightin' for?" The bodybuilder's laugh was harsh, practiced. "I ain't fightin' nothing. I'm just looking at what happens when legends outlive their welcome." That's when Vince stepped forward, his trainer's instincts kicking in the same way they had for 30 years of managing fighters who were outclassed, outgunned, or just plain outmatched. The difference was, this time, the fighter he was protecting had nothing left to prove. "Problem here, fellas?" Vince's voice cut through the tension, steady and calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The bodybuilder turned, sizing up this new player. Gray-haired, average height, wearing a faded Eagles jacket that had seen better decades. Not impressive by any physical standard, but something in his eyes made Marcus take a half step back. "No problem, Pops. Just having a conversation with your hero here about reality. Reality? Vince moved closer, positioning himself between Ali and the much larger man. Reality is you're standing on a corner in South Philly trying to pick a fight with a man who's got nothing to prove to anybody, especially you. The crowd sensed the shift, the way tension can pivot on a single moment. Marcus Kane's smile grew wider, more dangerous, as if this interruption was exactly what he'd been waiting for. Vincent Torino, Marcus said, and the way he spoke Vince's name made the older man's blood run cold. Been wondering when you'd show up. The recognition hit Vince like a right hook he never saw coming. This wasn't random. This wasn't some punk looking to make a name. This was something else entirely. Something that connected to parts of his past he'd spent decades trying to forget. "Do I know you, son?" Marcus Kane's smile turned predatory. "You should. You killed my father." The words hung in the October air like smoke, and Vince felt the ground shift beneath his feet as 20 years of carefully constructed distance collapsed in a single moment. The words "you killed my father" seemed to echo off the brick facades of the row houses, bouncing between parked cars and fire escapes until they settled into Vince's chest like shrapnel. The crowd around them had gone silent, sensing they'd stumbled into something deeper than street theater, something that belonged in confession booths and courtrooms rather than on the corner of Broad and Morris. Vince's mouth went dry. Behind him, he could hear Ali's labored breathing, the slight whistle that came with each exhale. The champion's presence had drawn him out here, but now Ali felt like a witness to something Vince had spent 20 years trying to bury. His mind raced through faces and names, searching for the connection that would explain how this moment had found him. "I don't know what you're talking about," Vince said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded hollow. Marcus Kane's eyes, pale blue, almost colorless, held a certainty that made lying pointless. "Bobby Kane," Marcus said, each syllable deliberate. "Ring any bells, trainer?" The name hit harder than the accusation. Bobby Kane, cruiserweight out of Newark. Good hands, granite chin, too much heart for his own good. Vince remembered the kid's laugh, the way he'd shadowbox in the mirror and throw combinations at his own reflection, talking trash to himself between rounds. Bobby had been 23 the night everything went wrong, young enough to think he was invincible, old enough to trust the man in his corner to keep him safe. Vince's peripheral vision caught Ali shifting beside him, the champion's head tilted slightly as if trying to place the name. Muhammad understood the weight of words like these. He'd been in enough corners himself to know that the relationship between fighter and trainer was sacred, built on trust that ran deeper than blood. "That was a long time ago," Vince said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the street noise. A SEPTA bus rumbled past, its diesel exhaust mixing with the smell of hoagies from the corner deli and the lingering smoke from someone's cigarette. Normal Philadelphia smells, normal Philadelphia sounds, but nothing felt normal anymore. Marcus took a step closer, and Vince noticed details he'd missed before. The way the younger man moved with controlled precision, like someone who'd spent years in gyms himself. The scar tissue around his knuckles, the slight thickening above his left eyebrow that spoke of too many sparring sessions or maybe not enough headgear. This wasn't just some muscle-bound punk looking for trouble. This was someone who understood the sport, who knew exactly what he was accusing Vince of. 20 years, Marcus said. "That's how long I've been looking for you." The crowd was getting restless, sensing the shift from public spectacle to private reckoning. A few people at the edges drifted away, but the core remained, drawn by the same instinct that made people slow down for car accidents. Mrs. Petrov from the bakery stood near the lamppost, her flour-dusted apron catching the afternoon light. She'd known Vince for 15 years, watched him transform from the respected trainer who'd briefly put South Philly boxing on the map to the quiet man who now struggled to keep his gym's lights on. "Vincent," Ali's voice was soft, but it carried the authority of someone who'd faced down Sonny Liston and George Foreman. "You know this boy?" The question forced Vince to look at Marcus again, really look at him. The resemblance was there if you knew where to find it. Bobby's jawline, Bobby's build before the muscle mass. But where Bobby had been quick to smile, Marcus carried himself like a man who'd forgotten how. Where Bobby had moved with the loose confidence of youth, Marcus moved like someone who'd learned to turn every moment into preparation for violence. "You got your father's eyes," Vince said, surprised by the sadness in his own voice. "He was a good kid. He was a great fighter," Marcus corrected. "Until you let him die in that ring." The accusation hung between them like a challenge, and Vince felt the familiar weight of guilt settling across his shoulders. He'd carried Bobby Kane's death for 2 decades, through 3 failed relationships, through the slow decline of his reputation, through countless nights when sleep came only with the help of bourbon and aspirin. He'd told himself it wasn't his fault, that the ref should have stopped it, that the doctors should have caught the signs earlier. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the gym was empty and the city was still, he knew the truth. He should have thrown in the towel, should have stopped the fight, should have protected his fighter when protection mattered more than pride. Now Bobby Kane's son stood in front of him on a South Philadelphia street corner, 20 years of anger carved into muscle and bone, demanding an accounting that Vince wasn't sure he could give. And Muhammad Ali, the greatest fighter who ever lived, was watching it all unfold, a living reminder of what happened when fighters trusted their corners to keep them safe. Vince could feel the weight of Ali's gaze, but it was Marcus who held his attention now. Marcus, whose very presence had ripped open wounds that had never properly healed. The crowd pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about in neighborhood bars and barbershops for years to come. "Atlantic City," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this moment countless times. "October 15th, 1978, the Paradise Casino. Bobby Kane versus Tommy the Tiger Martinez for the NABF Cruiserweight title." Each detail landed like a body shot. Vince remembered the humid air in the casino, how the cigarette smoke had hung in layers above the ring like gray clouds. He remembered the sound Bobby's gloves made hitting the heavy bag during warm-ups, the confident rhythm that had made everyone believe this was their night. Their ticket to the big time. "Your boy was ahead on all the cards going into the 9th, Marcus said, and Vince could hear Bobby's voice echoing across 2 decades. "We got him, Vince. We got him hurt." "Martinez was done," Vince whispered, the memory pulling him back despite every instinct telling him to walk away. "Your father had him against the ropes, just working the body. Beautiful combinations." Marcus's expression flickered, just for a moment, as if hearing praise for his father had caught him off guard. But the anger returned quickly, hardening his features. "Then what happened, trainer? Tell these people what happened in round 10. The October wind picked up, scattering leaves across the intersection and making the crowd pull their jackets tighter. But Vince felt hot, feverish, as if the guilt he'd been carrying was burning through his skin. Ali stepped closer, his champion's instincts recognizing the moment when a fighter was about to get dropped. "Round 10, Vince said, his voice barely audible. Bobby came out aggressive, too aggressive. "Because you told him to," Marcus said, "and there was no question in it. You told him to go for the knockout instead of boxing safe. You told him Martinez had nothing left." The truth of it hit Vince like cold water. He could see Bobby's face between rounds, blood trickling from a cut above his left eye that had opened in the 8th. The kid had been tired but winning, safe if he just stayed smart. But Vince had smelled the knockout, had seen Martinez wobbling, and he'd gotten greedy. "Finish him, Bobby. This is our moment. Go to the body and then take his head off." Martinez caught him with an uppercut, Vince continued, the words coming out in a rush now, like poison he needed to expel. Bobby went down hard, real hard. Ref counted to 8, but Bobby got up. He always got up. "Even though he shouldn't have," Marcus said. "Even though you could see something was wrong with his eyes. Even though he was staggering when he walked back to the center of the ring." Mrs. Petrov crossed herself, flowers still dusting her fingers. Tommy Ricci had appeared from the gym, drawn by the commotion, his face pale as he recognized the names being spoken. The boxing community in Philadelphia was small, and everyone knew the stories that weren't supposed to be told. The ref asked if he was okay, Vince said, and he could see it all happening again, frame by frame, like a movie he'd been forced to watch every night for 20 years. Bobby nodded, said he was fine. "But he wasn't fine," Ali said quietly, and something in the champion's voice suggested he'd been here before, had faced his own moments, when pride and safety collided in the crucible of the ring. Was he, Vincent? Vince closed his eyes, but that only made it worse. Behind his eyelids, he could see Bobby's face in those final seconds. The way his eyes had lost focus, the slight delay in his reflexes that should have been a red flag big enough to stop traffic. And he could see himself, younger then, hungrier, calculating the purse money and the rankings boost and all the doors that would open if Bobby could just last 3 more rounds. "I should have thrown in the towel," Vince admitted, the words scraping his throat raw. "After the first knockdown, I should have stopped it, but the title shot was right there. We were so close." Marcus pulled something from his jacket pocket, a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age and folded along lines that spoke of frequent handling. He held it up so the crowd could see the headline, "Young Fighter Dies Following Title Bout." "He lasted until round 12, Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly for the first time. "Took 2 more knockdowns before his brain finally gave up. Died in the ambulance on the way to Atlantic City Medical Center. Never woke up after that uppercut in round 10. The newspaper clipping fluttered in Marcus's hand like a dying bird, and Vince realized that his old life, the careful distance he'd maintained from the past, the quiet anonymity he'd cultivated, was over. There was no going back from this moment, no pretending that Bobby Kane's death was just another tragedy in a sport full of them. Marcus Kane had found him, and the reckoning Vince had been dreading for 20 years had finally arrived on a South Philadelphia street corner, with Muhammad Ali as witness and the whole neighborhood watching. The crowd began to scatter like pigeons after a gunshot. One by one, the neighbors who'd been drawn by the promise of street drama realized they'd stumbled into something too raw, too personal for casual consumption. Mrs. Petrov hurried back toward her bakery, her flour-dusted fingers working at her rosary beads. The teenagers with their notebooks slunk away, suddenly understanding this wasn't the kind of story they wanted to tell their friends. But some remained. Tommy Ricci stood frozen near the gym entrance, his mouth slightly open, as if the words he'd just heard needed time to settle. A few old-timers from the corner stayed put, men who remembered when boxing meant something in this neighborhood, when trainers like Vince Torino were respected figures instead of ghosts haunting empty gyms. Vince felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure. He wanted to run, to disappear back into his gym and lock the door behind him, pretend this confrontation was just another bad dream that would fade with morning coffee and the familiar rhythm of gloves hitting heavy bags. But Marcus Kane stood between him and escape, solid as a monument to 20 years of buried guilt. "So what now?" Vince asked, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. Inside, his heart was hammering against his ribs like a fighter trying to break out of a clinch. "You found me. You said your piece. What do you want?" Marcus folded the newspaper clipping carefully, his movements deliberate, almost reverent. "What do I want?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I want my father back. I want 20 years of my life back. I want to wake up tomorrow and not see his face every time I close my eyes." Ali shifted beside them, his presence both comforting and unsettling. The champion had been unusually quiet since Marcus produced the clipping, and Vince wondered what memories this was stirring up for him. How many fighters had Ali watched get hurt? How many corners had he been in when the line between brave and stupid disappeared in the heat of competition? "Your father knew the risks," Vince said, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt like cowardice. It was the same thing he'd been telling himself for 2 decades, the same hollow justification that kept him functional but never quite sane. Did he? Marcus stepped closer, close enough that Vince could smell his cologne, something expensive that didn't belong in this neighborhood. Did he know his trainer would sacrifice his life for a payday? Did he know the man he trusted to protect him would leave him defenseless when it mattered most? Tommy Ricci made a sound, half gasp, half sob. The kid had been training at Vince's gym for 3 years now, trusting the old man to guide his career, to keep him safe. The look on Tommy's face suggested that trust was evaporating in real time, replaced by something that looked like fear. Not fear of Marcus, but fear of Vince himself. That was the moment Vince understood the true scope of Marcus Kane's revenge. This wasn't just about confrontation or confession. This was about exposure, about destroying the carefully constructed myth that had allowed Vince to continue working as a trainer despite what had happened in Atlantic City. Word would spread through the boxing community like wildfire. The few fighters who still trusted him would find new corners. The gym would empty completely. "You planned this," Vince said. the realization hitting him like a delayed reaction to a hard shot. The whole thing, picking on Ali, knowing I'd come out. "You've been watching me." Marcus smiled for the first time, and it transformed his face completely. For a moment, Vince could see Bobby in that expression, not the broken fighter who died in an ambulance, but the young man who dreamed of titles and glory and trusted his trainer to help him achieve both. 3 weeks, Marcus said. "I've been in this neighborhood for 3 weeks, learning your routine. Coffee at Rizzo's every morning at 7, lunch at the corner deli when you remember to eat. You close the gym at 9, lock up, walk home alone to that studio apartment above the hardware store." The specificity was chilling. Vince felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical threats. This man had been studying him like a fighter studies tape of an opponent, looking for weaknesses, patterns, opportunities. Muhammad Ali was just luck, Marcus continued. But good luck made the whole thing more public. Ali spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the crisp October air. "This ain't about me, though. This about you two, and something that happened before I ever walked down this street." The champion was right, but his presence had changed everything. Without Ali as a catalyst, this confrontation would have happened in private, in the gym maybe, or in some alley where there were no witnesses. But now the whole neighborhood knew. The story would spread, mutate, grow with each telling until truth and rumor became indistinguishable. Vince looked around at the faces still watching. Fewer now, but more intense, more committed to seeing how this ended. He realized that his old life, the careful anonymity he'd built, was already gone. There was no going back, no pretending this conversation hadn't happened. Marcus Kane had found him, and the reckoning was just beginning. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. Vince could hear his own breathing, shallow and quick, mixing with the distant hum of traffic on Broad Street. The remaining onlookers had formed a loose semicircle, no longer casual observers but witnesses to something that felt increasingly inevitable and terrible. Marcus reached into his jacket again, and this time he pulled out a small digital recorder. The device looked innocuous in his large hands, but Vince felt his stomach drop as Marcus pressed a button and the tiny red light began blinking. "October 15th, 1978, Marcus said, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone conducting an interview. "Vincent Torino, trainer of record for Bobby Kane. Tell me about the 30 seconds between rounds 9 and 10. "Put that away," Vince said, but his voice cracked. He could see Tommy Ricci backing toward the gym door, the kid's face pale with something that looked like betrayal. How many times had Tommy asked about Vince's glory days, the fighters he'd trained, the big fights he'd worked? How many times had Vince deflected those questions with vague answers and changed subjects? "The 30 seconds when you had a choice," Marcus continued, ignoring Vince's request. "When you could have looked at my father's eyes and seen what everyone else saw, what the ringside doctor saw, what the commentators saw, what my mother saw from her seat in the 3rd row. Your mother was there." The words hit Vince like a physical blow. In all his nightmares about that night, he'd somehow never pictured Bobby's family watching. The crowd had been a blur of faces, anonymous and distant. But somewhere in that casino, a young woman had been watching her husband take punishment he couldn't handle, trusting that the man in his corner would protect him when protection mattered. "Was pregnant," Marcus said, and his voice finally broke. 6 months pregnant with me. She watched you send my father out for round 10 knowing something was wrong. She watched him fall. She watched him convulse on the canvas while you just stood there." Ali made a soft sound, almost a sigh. The champion's hands were steady, but Vince could see something shifting in his expression, a recognition that went beyond mere sympathy. Muhammad Ali had taken punishment that would have killed lesser men. He'd fought with broken jaws, swollen eyes, damaged brains. But he'd survived because the men in his corner had known when to protect him from himself. "The doctor wanted to stop it after round 8, Marcus continued, the recorder still blinking its malevolent red eye. "Dr. Paulson. He told the commission he had concerns about Bobby's responses. But you convinced them to let it continue. You personally vouched for your fighter's condition." Vince remembered Dr. Paulson, a thin man with thick glasses who'd seemed nervous about the whole proceedings. The doctor had pulled Vince aside between rounds, mentioned something about Bobby's pupils, about reaction times. But the purse was $50,000, more money than Vince had ever seen, and Bobby was ahead on all 3 cards. Just 3 more rounds. Just hold on for 3 more rounds. I told them he was fine, Vince admitted, the words scraping his throat raw. I told them Bobby was a warrior, that he could handle whatever Martinez had left. But you knew better. Marcus stepped closer, close enough that Vince could see the pain carved into the younger man's features, the way 20 years of anger had worn grooves around his eyes. In your heart, you knew better. The truth of it settled over Vince like a heavy coat. Yes, he'd known. Not consciously, not in words he could have articulated, but in the way Bobby's hands had trembled slightly when he reached for his water bottle. In the slight delay when Bobby responded to instructions. In the way his fighter's eyes had seemed to look through him instead of at him. A trainer learned to read those signs, had to read them to keep his fighters safe. It was the most sacred part of the relationship, the unspoken promise that someone was watching out for the man taking punches. And Vince had ignored every warning because he'd wanted the victory more than he'd wanted Bobby's safety. His last words, Marcus said, and now tears were streaming down his face, were asking for you. In the ambulance, before he lost consciousness for good, he kept saying, "Where's Vince? Where's my trainer?" He died thinking you'd abandoned him. The accusation landed like a knockout punch, and Vince felt his knees buckle slightly. He reached out to steady himself against a parked car, his vision blurring as 20 years of carefully controlled guilt came crashing down around him. The few remaining spectators seemed to sense they were witnessing something too private, too painful for public consumption, but they remained frozen in place. Ali's voice cut through the moment like a referee stopping a fight. "That's enough!" But Marcus Kane shook his head, the recorder still running, still documenting this confession that would destroy what remained of Vincent Torino's reputation. "No," Marcus said quietly. "It's not nearly enough." The recorder's red light pulsed like a heartbeat in the fading daylight, and Vince found himself staring at it as if hypnotized. 20 years of careful silence, 20 years of burying the truth so deep he'd almost convinced himself it was someone else's story, and now it was all spilling out onto a South Philadelphia street corner for posterity. "You want the whole truth?" Vince said, his voice gaining strength from somewhere he didn't recognize. "Fine, let's talk about the whole truth." Marcus's grip on the recorder tightened, his knuckles white against the black plastic. "Finally. Your father came to me when he was 19 years old," Vince began, the words flowing now like water through a broken dam. "Hungry kid from North Philly, hands like anvils, heart bigger than the Liberty Bell. But he had one problem." Ali shifted beside them, sensing something changing in the tenor of the conversation. The champion's weathered face showed the kind of attention he'd once reserved for studying opponents, reading the subtle signs that indicated when a fight was about to turn. "He couldn't say no," Vince continued. "Not to me, not to the promoters, not to anybody. Bobby Kane was the most agreeable fighter I ever trained, and that should have been a blessing. Instead, it was the thing that killed him." Marcus's confident expression flickered for the first time since he'd revealed his identity. "What are you talking about?" "The night before the Martinez fight, your father came to my hotel room," Vince said, the memory surfacing with painful clarity. 3 in the morning, still wired from the way in. He told me he'd been having headaches, bad ones. Said they started after the Mitchell fight 6 months earlier. The street around them seemed to grow quieter, as if the neighborhood itself was leaning in to listen. Tommy Ricci had stopped his retreat toward the gym, his young face reflecting a growing confusion about which version of the truth to believe. "I told him it was nerves," Vince admitted, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Pre-fight jitters. I gave him some aspirin and told him to get some sleep, but he kept talking. Said the headaches came with flashing lights sometimes, like someone was taking pictures inside his skull." Marcus lowered the recorder slightly, his breathing becoming shallow. That's not what you said before." "Because I've been lying to myself for 20 years, Vince shot back, and suddenly he was angry, not at Marcus, but at the universe, at boxing, at the 19-year-old version of himself who'd thought money and rankings were worth more than a man's life. Your father tried to tell me he was hurt, and I didn't want to hear it. I had contracts signed, television deals, my own reputation on the line." Ali spoke quietly, his words carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Fighter tries to warn his corner, corner's got to listen. That's the sacred trust. But I didn't listen, Vince continued, the confession gaining momentum like a freight train rolling downhill. I told Bobby that champions fight through pain, that Martinez was ripe for the picking, that this was our shot at the big time. I convinced him those headaches were just part of the game. Marcus's face had gone pale beneath his tan, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked younger than his years. The recorder shook slightly in his grip as he processed what he was hearing. So when I sent him out for round 10, Vince said, I wasn't just ignoring what I saw in the moment. I was ignoring what he'd been trying to tell me for months. Your father knew something was wrong with his head, and I talked him out of trusting his own body. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Mrs. Petrov had emerged from her bakery again, drawn by some inexplicable instinct, her flour-dusted apron catching the light from the street lamps that were beginning to flicker on in the gathering dusk. That's impossible, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mom never said anything about headaches. Because he didn't want to worry her, Vince replied. Your father was protecting everyone except himself. And I let him do it because it was easier than finding a new meal ticket. The words landed like a physical blow, and Marcus actually staggered backward. The arrogant certainty that had carried him through the confrontation was cracking, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to confusion. For 20 years he'd carried a simple story of betrayal and negligence. Now Vince was offering him something more complex, more painful, the knowledge that his father had been complicit in his own destruction. You're lying, Marcus whispered. But even he didn't seem to believe it. I wish I was, Vince said. God help me, I wish I was. The recorder slipped from Marcus's fingers, clattering onto the concrete with a sharp crack that echoed off the narrow street. The red light flickered once and died, taking with it 20 years of carefully rehearsed accusations and righteous fury. Marcus stared down at the broken device as if it contained the fragments of everything he thought he knew about his father's death. No, he said, his voice barely audible. No, you're rewriting history, making excuses. But Vince could see the doubt creeping into Marcus's eyes, the way his massive frame seemed to deflate as the simple narrative of victimhood and negligence gave way to something far more complicated. The truth wasn't clean. It never was in boxing, where the line between courage and stupidity blurred until it disappeared entirely. Ali stepped forward, his presence filling the space between the two men like a referee moving in to separate clinched fighters. Son, he said to Marcus, his voice carrying the gentleness that had surprised opponents who expected only thunder. I knew your daddy. Not well, but I knew him. Fought on the same cards 3-4 times. Marcus looked up sharply, searching Ali's weathered face for deception or sympathy. You never said... Bobby Kane was a good man, Ali continued, ignoring the interruption. Polite, respectful. Always asked about my family, remembered my children's names. But he was also scared, and trying real hard not to show it. The admission hung in the cooling air like a prayer half-spoken. Tommy Ricci had moved closer despite himself, drawn by the magnetic pull of Muhammad Ali's voice, even as the story it was telling threatened to destroy his faith in the man who'd been training him. Scared of what? Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Of disappointing people, Ali said simply. Of letting down his trainer, his wife, the folks who'd paid to see him fight. Your daddy carried the weight of other people's expectations, and it was killing him long before he stepped into that ring with Martinez. Vince felt something breaking open in his chest, a pressure that had been building for 2 decades finally finding release. He asked me once if I thought he should retire, he said, the memory surfacing like a body rising from deep water. This was maybe 8 months before Martinez. We were working mitts, just the two of us in the gym, and he stopped in the middle of a combination. Marcus was staring at him now with an intensity that made Vince's skin crawl, but he pressed on. The truth was ugly, but it was the only thing left to give. He said, Vince, what if I'm not good enough for the level we're trying to reach? And I told him that kind of thinking was for quitters. I told him champions don't ask questions like that. Mrs. Petrov had approached close enough to hear, her lined face reflecting the kind of maternal concern that transcended language barriers. She'd seen enough broken men in her 73 years to recognize the sound of a confession when she heard one. But he was asking the right question, Vince continued. He was trying to tell me he was damaged, that something fundamental had changed after the Mitchell fight. And I shut him down because I was afraid of losing my meal ticket. Marcus bent to pick up the broken recorder, his hands shaking as he tried to fit the pieces back together. The device was beyond repair, but he kept working at it anyway, as if fixing the machine could somehow restore the simple certainty he'd carried for 20 years. All this time, Marcus whispered, I thought you just didn't care. I thought you saw he was hurt and sent him out anyway because you were greedy or stupid or both. I was greedy, Vince said, but I was also willfully blind. Your father trusted me to see what he couldn't say, and I chose not to see it. That makes it worse, not better. Allie's voice cut through the gathering darkness like a lighthouse beam. Makes it human, though. Makes it the kind of mistake a man can learn from, if he's brave enough to face it. The comment drew sharp looks from both Vince and Marcus, but Ali's expression remained serene, almost meditative. The champion had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters between athletic glory and human frailty, and his perspective carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. 20 years I've been planning this moment, Marcus said, finally giving up on the recorder and letting the broken pieces fall through his fingers. 20 years imagining what I'd say, how I'd make you pay. But you're telling me my father was as responsible as you were. I'm telling you the truth, Vince replied. Finally. Maybe too late, but finally. The street around them had grown quiet, the last of the casual observers drifting away as full darkness settled over the neighborhood. Only the core participants remained. Two men bound together by tragedy, a champion trying to prevent another soul from being lost to bitterness, and a handful of witnesses who understood they were watching something that could not be undone. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and there was nowhere left to hide. Marcus stood in the broken glass of his certainty, the recorder's fragments scattered at his feet like the pieces of the story he'd carried for 20 years. The simple narrative, noble father, negligent trainer, clear villain, lay shattered alongside the device that was supposed to capture Vince's confession. Instead, it had recorded something far more devastating, the truth. You destroyed my life, Marcus said, but the words came out hollow, stripped of their practiced venom. I became this, he gestured at his massive frame, the product of 2 decades spent building himself into a weapon. I became this thing to punish you. And what did it cost you? Ali asked gently, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd learned that victory without wisdom was just another kind of defeat. The question hit Marcus like a body shot, and for a moment his composure cracked completely. Everything, he whispered. My marriage, my kids. 20 years of rage burning everything I touched. Vince watched the younger man's face cycle through emotions. Fury, grief, confusion, and finally something that looked like recognition. Marcus had spent 2 decades building himself into an instrument of vengeance, sculpting his body and sharpening his hatred until both had become perfect weapons. But weapons had no other purpose, no other identity beyond destruction. I followed you for months, Marcus continued, his voice gaining a strange confessional quality. Learned your routines, your weaknesses. I was going to destroy you piece by piece. Your gym, your reputation, your peace of mind. I wanted you to feel as helpless as my father felt in that ring. And now? Vince asked. Marcus looked down at his hands, massive things that could crush a man's windpipe without effort. Now I don't know who I am anymore. If my father knew he was hurt, if he chose to keep fighting. The sentence hung unfinished, a bridge to nowhere. He chose to trust his trainer, Ali said quietly. That don't make him weak. That don't make him guilty. But it don't make Vince innocent either. The champion's words carved through the darkness between absolution and condemnation, finding the narrow space where truth lived. Neither man was blameless, but neither was evil. They were simply human beings who'd made choices in impossible circumstances, and those choices had echoed through decades. Tommy Ricci finally broke his silence, his young voice cutting through the heavy air. Mr. Torino, is this why you never talk about the old days? Why you change the subject when I ask about your big fights? Vince turned to face his current student, seeing in Tommy's eyes the same hunger he'd once seen in Bobby Kane's, the same trust, the same willingness to follow his trainer into whatever battles lay ahead. The parallel was so sharp it took his breath away. "Yeah, kid," Vince said. "This is why." "But you saved me," Tommy pressed on, confusion evident in his voice. "When I was heading down the wrong path, you gave me boxing, you gave me discipline, purpose." Marcus looked up sharply at this, studying Vince with new attention. Here was something his research hadn't uncovered, the possibility of redemption, of lessons learned and applied. "How many fighters have you trained since my father?" Marcus asked. 17, Vince answered without hesitation. 17 kids who came to me hungry, looking for something boxing could give them, and I've stopped every one of them from fighting when they shouldn't. Protected them from themselves, from promoters, from their own ambition. Mrs. Petrov stepped forward, her accented voice adding an unexpected weight to the moment. "This man," she said, pointing at Vince, "he stopped my grandson from fighting with concussion 2 years ago. Lost money, lost reputation with promoter, but he protected the boy." Marcus absorbed this information like a boxer taking punches, each revelation reshaping his understanding of the man he'd spent 20 years learning to hate. The simple story of a negligent trainer had become something more complex, a man who'd made a terrible mistake and spent 2 decades trying to atone for it. "So what now?" Marcus asked, and for the first time since revealing his identity he sounded lost. 20 years of my life built around hating you, and you're telling me you've already been punishing yourself." Vince looked at this broken giant of a man and saw something he recognized. The particular kind of pain that came from outliving your mistakes, from carrying guilt that had nowhere to go. It was the same weight he'd been carrying since 1978, the same burden that had driven him to protect every fighter who'd come after Bobby Kane. "Now you decide who you want to be," Vince said simply. "You can keep being the son of Bobby Kane's tragedy, or you can be something else, something your own." The street fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic, and the hum of fluorescent lights flickering to life in shop windows. The confrontation that had begun with such clear purpose, revenge, exposure, justice, had evolved into something neither man had expected, an opportunity for both of them to finally move beyond the night that had defined their lives. The climax had arrived not with violence or dramatic revelation, but with the quiet recognition that some truths were too complex for simple justice. 3 weeks later, Vince stood in the same spot where his world had nearly collapsed, watching the morning light paint golden squares across the gym windows. The street looked exactly the same, Mrs. Petrov arranging fresh bread in her bakery window, the familiar crack in the sidewalk where tree roots had pushed through concrete, the faint echo of gloves against heavy bags drifting from his gym. But something fundamental had shifted in the air itself, like the moment after a thunderstorm when the pressure finally breaks. Marcus had disappeared that night without another word, leaving only the broken recorder and the weight of 20 years' worth of rage that no longer had anywhere to land. Vince had expected relief or closure or some clean emotion that would mark the end of his longest nightmare. Instead, he'd found something more complex, a kind of earned sadness that acknowledged both the permanence of loss and the possibility of moving forward. The bell above his gym door chimed, and Tommy Ricci emerged with his gear bag slung over his shoulder, sweat still glistening on his forehead from their morning session. The kid had been different since that night, more thoughtful, asking harder questions about when to push through pain and when to listen to his body's warnings. The conversation had aged him in ways that might serve him well. "You heading to the community center today?" Tommy asked. Vince nodded. 6 months ago, he'd started offering free boxing lessons to kids in the neighborhood, teaching fundamentals and discipline to anyone who wanted to learn. It wasn't penance. Penance implied an end to suffering, and Vince had accepted that Bobby Kane would live in his conscience forever. It was something simpler, the daily choice to use what he'd learned from his worst moment. "Tell Marcus I said the stance work is coming along," Tommy added casually, as if mentioning that someone had stopped by for coffee. Vince's head snapped up. "Marcus?" "Yeah, he's been helping with the younger kids." "Didn't you know?" Tommy grinned at his trainer's expression. "He's got good hands for teaching, patient, and when he talks about dedication and hard work, they listen. Guy's built like a superhero." The revelation settled into Vince's chest like a stone dropping into still water. Marcus had found his way to the community center, to the place where damaged people tried to help other damaged people build something better than what they'd inherited. It shouldn't have surprised him. Where else would someone go when they needed to discover who they might become beyond their pain? "He asked about me?" Vince found himself saying. "Every time," Tommy replied, "but not in a bad way. More like he's trying to figure something out." After Tommy left, Vince walked the 3 blocks to Broad Street, where a small bronze plaque marked the location of the old Spectrum. The arena had been demolished years ago, replaced by a parking lot and a cluster of office buildings, but Bobby Kane had fought there twice, won both times, before everything went wrong. Vince had never visited the spot before, had actively avoided it for 2 decades. But standing there now, he could almost hear the echo of crowds that had cheered for young fighters with dreams bigger than their circumstances. Bobby Kane had been one of them, a kid from North Philly who dared to believe he could punch his way to something better. "He was a good fighter," said a voice behind him. Vince turned to find Marcus approaching slowly, hands buried in the pockets of a windbreaker that made him look less imposing than the muscle-bound giant who'd confronted him weeks ago. The younger man's face showed lines of exhaustion, as if he'd been carrying something heavy and had finally set it down. "Yeah," Vince agreed. "He was." They stood together in silence, 2 men sharing the weight of a ghost neither could resurrect, but both had learned to carry differently. The anger between them had burned itself out, leaving behind something more sustainable, the recognition that grief didn't require enemies, only witnesses. "I start anger management next week," Marcus said finally, court ordered, "after I put my fist through a wall at my ex-wife's house. But I think I'm ready for it now." Vince nodded. Healing happened in its own time, often long after the wound had been inflicted. Some people never found their way to it at all. "The kids at the center call you Coach Marcus," Vince said. "They don't know who my father was. To them, I'm just some guy who shows up and cares whether they keep their hands up." Marcus smiled slightly, the first genuine expression Vince had ever seen cross his face. "Turns out that's enough. Being useful instead of angry." The morning traffic flowed around them, ordinary people heading to ordinary jobs, carrying their own invisible burdens and small hopes. Vince thought of Bobby Kane at 19, hungry and fearless and trusting his trainer to keep him safe. The memory would always hurt, but it no longer felt like a weapon pointed at his heart. Some stories didn't end with redemption or justice. They ended with 2 broken men learning to build something useful from the pieces of their shared catastrophe, one careful day at a time. That had to be enough.